pansexual worldview that says all forms of sexual expression are equal and acceptable can be credited to Dr. Alfred C. Kinsey, the father of the sexual revolution. In Fox Searchlight's new biopic, simply titled Kinsey, he is portrayed as a tragic hero who fights for the sexual rights of a repressed society.
We knew Hollywood would airbrush Alfred Kinsey and make him out to be a pioneer of sexual liberation, instead of showing him for the fraud and aider and abetter of child molestation that he really was.
For over 20 years, Judith Reisman has investigated Alfred Kinsey's so-called scientific findings, and in her book, Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, she reveals the many disturbing faces of Dr. Alfred Kinsey.
His biographers all say that Kinsey was a hands-on scientist. There is nothing that he would have accepted in his book unless he had participated in it, seen it, done it for himself.
When Dr. Alfred Kinsey released his first book in 1948, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, it was called an A-bomb. Kinsey's K-bomb on sexuality. At a time when sex was rarely spoken about, much less studied scientifically, Indiana University professor and zoologist Dr. Alfred Kinsey began his sex research in the late 1930s. Supported by a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to study human sexuality, Kinsey found himself on a mission to liberate society from its sexual repression and normalize all sexual taboos.
He was a perverted man, deeply perverted. He may even have died of wounds that were self-inflicted during his own sexual activity because he was into self-mutilation and pain. He was a sadomasochistic homosexual.
But in the Hollywood tribute to Kinsey, actor Liam Neeson plays the part of the controversial sex researcher in search of the truth about sexual practices. Bob Knight, director of the Culture and Family Institute for Concerned Women for America, says homosexual director Bill Condon was clever in disguising the true Kinsey.
They showed him having some problems in the movie. They showed some warts. And it's supposed to lure the viewer into the notion that we're showing you the real Kinsey, warts and all. Pay no attention to anything worse. But there was much worse.
One of his key researchers described the fact that Kinsey actually threw out 75% of the people he interviewed. It's as though you had an election, throw out 75% of your votes, and then the 25% win.
In fact, Kinsey's distorted data, collected mostly in the 1940s, alleged that 95% of the male population had committed sexual offenses serious enough to go to jail, and that 40% of married women were having affairs. But why did he garner such credibility then?
We trusted our doctors and we trusted our scientists, and that trust was severely misplaced. So the whole presentation by Indiana University of Kinsey was carefully scripted. It was a Madison Avenue presentation telling the entire nation that Kinsey was finally telling us the truth about ourselves.
In a shocking British television documentary called Secret History, Kinsey's Pedophiles, Kinsey's successor as director of the Kinsey Institute, Paul Gebhard, revealed that Alfred Kinsey was interested in having sex with men, children, and animals. One of Kinsey's most damaging and outrageous claims was that children were sexual from birth.
Alfred Kinsey took away my innocence that I didn't even know I had.
This woman, under the assumed name Esther White, says she is a direct victim of Dr. Alfred Kinsey's. Her grandfather, who went to college with Dr. Kinsey, helped Kinsey gather data on the sexual behaviors of children.
When I was about 3 or 4, my grandfather molested me. And I didn't understand. He was angry at me and said, "Don't you ever tell your grandmother or your mother." I was conditioned to believe that the things that he did were loving and caring things. He was calling it lovemaking. I know now that it's molestation.
One of Kinsey's closest associates and co-authors, Wardell Pomeroy, in a sex publication stated, We found many beautiful and mutually satisfying relationships between fathers and daughters. In another publication, Pomeroy claimed, incest between adults and younger children can prove to be a satisfying and enriching experience.
I was constantly afraid because I didn't like what was being done. It was something I had to do because I had to be an obedient child. But I didn't like doing it, and there were times I went into convulsions with excruciating pain in my back, spasms that hit like knife in my back. But he wasn't paying any attention to me. One time, there was a piece of paper that had blown off of the vanity, and when I picked it up, it had little boxes on the side of the page and a lot of questions, and there was a word on there I didn't understand. I asked him what the word orgasm was. As my father was explaining about the word orgasm, he said he had to make a deadline and that he had to send it away.
Esther didn't know anything about the way the Kinsey questionnaire was constructed. When she described to me what her father was filling out, that was the questionnaire.
Esther remembers being questioned by Kinsey and members of his research team in her grandfather's home.
I was told that this was a very important meeting, and I was going to meet a very important man, and that he was going to ask me some questions, and that I was to answer them correctly, and the questions would be, are you happy with your family? Do you love your daddy? And as they were about to leave, my grandfather reminded Alfred Kinsey that, what about the check? And Mr. Kinsey said, oh, I almost forgot. I had the check made out to you and your son because I didn't know which way you would want to split it. I saw the check. I saw Alfred Kinsey hand that check to my grandfather.
According to the Kinsey Institute's own figures, between 317 and 2,035 children were used in these types of sexual experiments. Kinsey and his associates admit they use the diaries of sexual predators for much of their research of the sexual behaviors of children. But in the name of science, their identities were protected, even after Kinsey's name was linked with Nazi pedophile Fritz von Balusek.
It was roughly 60 years ago when von Balusek was arrested for the rapes of many children and the possible murder of a little girl. The judge, when they tried von Balusek, who was a very aristocratic fellow and had a very high place in the legal profession, when he finally came to trial, the judge said, I can't believe that you did this. You did this all for Kinsey, it would appear. And von Balusek replied, well, Kinsey himself asked me to do this.
But these headlines never hit the stands in the United States, and so the Kinsey propaganda campaign continued.
That the German papers at that very time were printing that Kinsey had been corresponding with this Nazi pedophile, and then it never made it to our newspapers, is clear indication of the control that the Rockefeller Foundation had, along with Indiana University.
Recently, the New York Times, exploring the Hollywood version of Kinsey, reported an important fact that Dr. Reisman has been telling us all along. Kinsey corresponded with many pedophiles, von Balusek and another by the name of Rex King, who molested hundreds of little boys and girls between the ages of 2 months and 15 years. He was also known as Mr. Green.
For the New York Times to actually report that Kinsey wrote to Dr. von Baliuchek and to Green and told them both that he wooed them and that he rejoiced at the information that they sent about their sexual violations of children, that's a major blow for the Kinsey Institute.
Wright says Kinsey's influence has had far-reaching consequences most people have only become aware of recently.
Kinsey went around the country testifying before state legislatures, most notably in Illinois and in California, advocating that sex offender penalties be lowered, because his research proved that people aren't really that harmed by this kind of sex, that it's the hysteria that accompanies child sexual abuse that is the real problem.
The children with sexual from birth then justifies the idea that children can not only have sex with each other, but they can have sex with adults if they're loving adults and loving sex, and in effect that they can begin to see the laws of age of consent drop dramatically, which they did post-Kinsey through the American Law Institute Model Penal Code.
The Model Penal Code was created by a group of law professors, judges, and lawyers, and was the blueprint that legal professionals use to revise our criminal laws. Authorized Kinsey biographer Gaithorne Hardy is quoted as saying, "The Model Penal Code of 1955 is virtually a Kinsey document. At one point, Kinsey is cited 6 times in 12 pages.
In the areas of sex crimes, the law of the American Law Institute reflected the Kinsey studies and ultimately was enacted into state law.
Former Senator to California, Assemblyman Ray Haynes, says Kinsey's influence on the culture has caused irreparable damage to victims of sexual crimes.
And so we ended up putting child molesters in prison for 3, 4, and 5 years. Well, we now know Kinsey was wrong. Child molesters are child molesters for life. And what we have done since the adoption of these laws is damaged thousands of children's lives because we've let child molesters back out on the streets based on a faulty study.
I would like to see an investigation of all of this. Get it out in the open. Let the American public make the determination as to what happened, who did it, why, and let our congressmen, our legislators do their proper job in this regard.
Not surprisingly, porn tycoon Hugh Hefner was inspired by Kinsey's studies.
Hugh Hefner cited Kinsey often in his early Playboy philosophy columns in Playboy magazine to justify pornography and say that science has shown it doesn't hurt anybody. Might as well mainstream it. Well, America bought that message, unfortunately. But one reason Hefner included the Kinsey studies in his magazines was to give it literary or scientific merit so he could get around the pornography laws of the time.
30 years ago in Roe v. Wade on the abortion issue, Kinsey was used to justify legalizing abortion. Kinsey's the one who gives them the so-called hard data. Hard data being that more than 25% of our married women are having abortions with no problem, and 95% of our single women who are pregnant are having abortions with no problem. And therefore, since so many women are having abortions and there are no problems, we should legalize abortion.
Kinsey's influence has gone far beyond the spread of pornography, the legalization of abortion, and the loosening of our sex laws. Kinsey thought of himself as a social engineer.
Kinsey provided the intellectual firepower for a lot of groups, like the ACLU, like Planned Parenthood, like the Lambda Legal Defense Fund, the homosexuals lawyers, NAMBLA, to break down the sexual mores that protected our women and children from sexual predators.
Alfred Kinsey worked with Planned Parenthood to create SIECUS, the Sex Information and Education Council of the United States. And so the Kinsey model of child sexuality, derived from the actual molestation of kids, became the animating principle behind most sex education until abstinence programs came along.
Kinsey was the inspiration for Harry Hay, who started the homosexual movement, as a political movement. But when he read Kinsey, he said he determined that, hey, if 10% of the population is homosexual, which Kinsey claimed at the time, 10 to 37%, then we have a political movement here. And we can redefine ourselves not as people who engaged in sodomy, which was against the law, not as people who did something, but as people who just are something, and as a discriminated class.
Kinsey's legacy is enormous. His cold, dead hand is still on the throttle of the sexual revolution.